Okay, everybody, it's Chapter 3, Lesson 3. Chapter 3, Lesson 3. Looking at the history of recreation as we're moving through the time periods here. We're in the 19th century, and we're moving from the colonial period to an industrial revolution time period. And you're looking at urbanization. There's a shift from the rural to the urban centers because of the factories. The population was rising rapidly. People were kind of being squeezed into the various tenements in the inner cities because of the immigration issue. There's a lot of child labor going on. There was some inner city conflicts were beginning because there's too many people in one place. And urban centers were really not prepared for this boom. And it's interesting, the availability of leisure was fairly low, and there wasn't as many things for folks to do because they were all kind of packed in there, and there's so many different things that were happening. And so if you're looking, there was a couple things that were going on at that time. One was the growth of commercial amusements. The growth of commercial amusements. And this is this traveling amusement park, which was kind of interesting. You know, if you've been to the Renaissance Fair here in Arizona, if you've been to the Renaissance Fair, it's very similar to that. There was some strange folks there, as as most folks would say. They might not think it's strange, but it's kind of this right-brained, kind of theatrical, somewhat out there experience. But people go to the Renaissance Festival, have a fun time. I go, I have a great time. But these commercial amusements, this traveling amusement show was very common, very popular, and travel around and come to the city and put on shows and do various things. And it's very popular, yet very scary, and it wasn't regulated. Not that things have to be regulated for them to be good, but they did kind of take on a bad reputation of being a bit scary. Some children would actually go to some of these commercial amusement ventures and not come back. So at some point the government decided to step in as it was growing. It was really receiving more revenue from all the many new residents in the states. And what you have is the beginning of this recreation movement. And the recreation movement is really forms of leisure activity provided in an organized way. This will be on your test. So recreation movement, or at the beginning of the recreation movement, is leisure activity provided in an organized way. This is either by a government agency, or by a non-profit, or a voluntary agency, or a for-profit agency, with the intent of achieving desirable social outcomes. So, for example, this traveling amusement or commercial amusements was not producing very positive outcomes. And so these kind of amusement commercial interests, these groups kind of got driven out of town, and they were taken over by non-profit and more voluntary-based groups that provided amusement, kind of a clean amusement where children could go and not have anything happen to them. And so this is the beginning of the recreation movement, kind of commodifying leisure activities, whether for-profit or non-profit, and making them into a pure and holistic experience where people don't have to worry about having problems when it comes to the recreational pursuits, doing things happening in an organized way to provide positive social outcomes. And there are many ways that this was done. These were set up through by community centers. The first community center was born out of this movement, sponsored by nonprofit organizations. The first summer camp was born out of this movement, where you have summer camp, places for kids to go in the summer, a recreation or leisure-based experience for a week or 2 weeks, or a significant amount of time. I'm sure most of you listening to this right now remember going to summer camp. If you didn't go to summer camp, I'm sorry. It's one of the best experiences I think a kid can have growing up, where you're basically going someplace for a week to purely have fun, and there's no parents. So it's pretty exciting stuff. And you also had recreation-based summer school. You had intramural sports-based programs out of the community center, not just for youth but for adults. So here you have leisure activities in an organized way to produce positive social outcomes. And this is what happened at the turn of the century as more money was moving into the government and more money was moving in and out of the cities. There were voluntary and for-profit organizations set up that focused on leisure. And there's many of these popular organizations that have been around for a long time, like the YMCA, okay, or the Appalachian Mountain Club, very popular organizations around for a long time. So as we're moving on here, a couple things to remember is that Yosemite Valley, okay, or the Yosemite, was very controversial. John Muir was a very controversial figure in that time for the conservation movement or the establishment of the purely wild area, or a very unique, desirable area. Oftentimes we do a little paper on John Muir. Not sure if we will in this class. But the first conservation action was in 1864. In 1864, a little prior to that Industrial Revolution, Congress set aside an extensive wilderness area in the Yellowstone area. And that would be your first national park, is that. And also later in the 1800s was the creation of the National Park Service. Or the Sierra Club came out of that time period as well, and Yosemite was also became a national park, which was the second national park to be put on the books. You have a few state parks. First state park came in Michigan and Wisconsin. These two together established the first state park, and it was all about forestry preservation and conservation. But they did allow hunting there. Okay, so about forestry, conservation, and preservation, and that's where the first state park came into play. And the first, as you may have guessed, the first city or municipal park was New York's Central Park. The first city park funded by taxpayers was Central Park in New York. Okay, so moving on, we've got a couple of things here. As I mentioned before, during this time with this recreation movement, or harnessing leisure activities provided in an organized way to produce positive social outcomes, you have the playground movement. And in the playground movement, there's a couple people and a couple events to remember. First, what we have is the development of the Boston Sand Garden. Boston Sand Garden it started kind of as a fluke. It was just a big pile of sand, and there was an individual that noticed that there were many children who didn't have a safe place to stay, especially in the inner city when it was very overcrowded with many immigrants. And so there were several people involved in looking at this, and one of the ideas was that if the city, okay, or voluntary organization could provide a safe place for kids to play, then there'd be less crime and there'd be less tension in the inner parts of the city, less discrimination, less everything. So the Boston Sand Garden did come out of that. And this was really founded or really pushed by Joseph Lee. And Joseph Lee was a philanthropist. He was considered the father of the playground movement. And Boston Sand Garden, putting the sand there and then setting up some infrastructure, was all about providing a safe place for kids to play. That's all it was to provide a safe place for kids to play. And Joseph Lee, father of the playground movement, being a philanthropist and a lawyer, didn't have any issues with money, and so his first the Boston Sand Garden was his first model or playground model, where he also started He was also the president and started the organization, the Playground Association of America, and then of course was president for about 27 years. So coming up with the model playground, coming up with this whole concept of the playground, Nowadays, we think of it's like it's nothing. There's there's playgrounds all over the place, and they're important. There's kids at them, I guess, except when in July, in the middle of the day when it's too hot. So it's a very big movement, very, very strategic, and very important. It goes along with play, or the movement is play as education. Next thing that we have is we have Gulick, Luther Gulick, and this was the first individual to establish a summer school. And what he did was establish a summer school that was recreation based. So it wasn't the summer school that we know of now when we say that term. It's the summer school, it's the summer camp is really what it was. He was the first president of the organization called Campfire Girls. He was also instrumental in the establishment of the Playground Association of America with Joseph Lee during that same time. Moving on, and lastly, we have Jane Addams, who established the Whole House in Chicago. She was passionate for immigrants and then their transition into America, and was a big, strong believer in recreation, and that recreation needed to be a part of everyone's life, including those who had immigrated, who were working hard and attempting their best to assimilate into the American culture and way of life. Okay, I'll be back.